Are you able to see them?
Yeah, can you put it on presenter? There we go. Perfect. All right, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us so early in the day. I hope everyone's had their coffee or tea or whatever they need in the mornings to have a good day. I think a couple of you have already started doing this, but please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat box. We'd love to hear from you, your name, where you're joining us from, your agency, your pronouns, and your role there. And like Mary said, we'll have a couple of opportunities to engage throughout the training. We want to hear from you all. So welcome to What You Need to Know, Providing Victim Services for Incarcerated Survivors. Next slide. Yep, great. So Mary already went over this, but if you have any questions, please enter them in the chat box and we'll get to them at the end of the training. We'll also be doing a couple of questions, like I said, where we'd love to hear your responses. So please enter those in the chat box as well. And then before we get started, we want to introduce just a couple of folks. I want to introduce Michelle Mueller and ask her to join us to say a couple of words. She's obviously from DSVS, and she's the countywide human trafficking and sexual violence coordinator for Fairfax County. Michelle, do you want to join us?
Hi, thanks everyone for coming. Just to let you know, this is part of a year-long effort, a long-term effort to boost awareness and assistance for sexual violence survivors in Fairfax County. We will have 2 more trainings in this series on sexual violence and strangulation and sexual harassment, and we'll send that information when we send out the email to everyone after the presentation. We're so excited to work on this issue because incarcerated persons are at such high risk of sexual violence and such need of services, and we really appreciate the work of our sheriff's office. We've partnered with them and have an MOU to provide services and confidential assistance to people who are in the adult detention center. And just so anyone knows, there's our hotline, 703-360-7273, and anyone, including people in detention center, are free to call us 24 hours for emotional assistance and referral to other services. We really appreciate Nicole coming. I saw her present at a national conference, and we're so fortunate she's really the national expert on this. So thanks very much, Nicole. I'll just make a pitch too. This is one thing I heard at Nicole's national presentation was really call people on it when they make jokes about people being raped in jail or prison. You know, it's so pervasive in our culture that we don't really think about it sometimes, but it really supports it, the re-victimization and the trauma that a lot of people face. So call people on that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Michelle. I also want to give a chance to Mr. Ron Kidwell to introduce himself. Next slide, please. He's the PREA coordinator for the Fairfax County Sheriff's Office. He is also a DOJ certified PREA auditor, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And I'm excited that he's here with us today to share his expertise and insights. Mr. Kidwell, if you'd like to just say hi.
Good morning, everyone. Like Nicole said, my name is Ron Kidwell, and I'm currently the PREA coordinator for the Fairfax County Sheriff's Office. Prior to that, I actually retired from the Fairfax County Sheriff's Office in 2017 with 30 years of experience. I retired as a major, and I was the commander of the jail from 2012 to 2017. After my retirement, I became DOJ certified as a PREA auditor, and from 2019 to current, I am performing PREA audits. I've done I'm on my 7th one right now. Most of them all taking place in the state of Virginia. I do have one for Camp Lejeune in September, so I usually try to stay in what I know, and that's Virginia. So, but I'm venturing out. So that's who I am. The Sheriff's Office brought me back part-time to establish PREA standards in the facility. So we've been working with that. I work with DSVS, like Michelle said, and other agencies to develop MOUs. The Fairfax County Police Department, DSVS for their services, Inova Hospital for the SANE exams and things of that nature, established an SOP, provided the training. So COVID kind of slowed us down, but we're hoping to be try to be certified, accredited by the spring of 2022.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Ron. So next, I just want to give a quick special thanks to the Office for Victims of Crime in the U.S. Department of Justice for helping to fund this presentation. And just to note that the opinions, findings, conclusions, and recommendations expressed in this training are of the presenters and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Department of Justice or the Office for Victims of Crime. So I'll introduce myself next. As Angie said, I'm Nicole de la Torre. I'm a program director at Detention International. I use she, her pronouns. And just to share a little bit about JDI briefly, we are a health and human rights organization that seeks to end sexual abuse in all forms of detention. Next slide, please. Our mission is carried out by working with corrections officials, rape crisis advocates, and policymakers to make detention facilities safe. We promote public attitudes that value the dignity and safety of people in detention, and we support incarcerated survivors of sexual abuse and sexual harassment. And I'll talk a little bit about how we do those things throughout the training today. And JDI's core principle is that no matter what crime a person may have committed, rape is not part of the penalty. We all know this, but I want to emphasize that prisoners are members of our communities, even if their lives are hidden away from view. And just like any member of our community, prisoners deserve to be safe from sexual abuse and to have access to quality rape crisis services. There are now more opportunities than ever because of PREA for prisoners to get high quality confidential victim services from community-based rape crisis centers. And that's what we're here to talk about today. Also, not only are they part of our larger community, each year more than 600,000 citizens return to neighborhoods across America after serving time in federal and state prisons. So 95% of people essentially that are incarcerated in state prisons will eventually return to their communities outside of detention. We'll hear a lot in this training about why it's so important that survivors in detention get victim services, the lack at times of meaningful emotional support in the facility, the distrust of others, the culture that can exist in correctional settings, and the incredibly high rates of existing trauma. So while this population in so many ways is disconnected from our outside society, they're absolutely part of the fabric of our communities. And most, again, will return to the outside world one day and will bring that trauma with them. So it's really important that we allow them to begin to heal as part of their rehabilitation when they're incarcerated. Okay, and then one last thing before we move into the kind of substance of this training, I want to share a video, and I think Angie might be able to load that for us. If not, I'm happy to share my screen.
Are you able to see the video?
Looks like it might be slow to load. I can share mine if that's easier, Angie. All right, let me know in the chat box if you can't hear or see it, but I'm going to press play and make it full screen.
He's the one who famously said, "I'd take a bullet for Donald Trump." Well, now that he's looking at prison time, we'll see if he's willing to take a dick.
People think that prisoners deserve whatever they get.
Police report described him as 5'9" and 140 pounds. Or as his cellmate put it, just right.
I was forced to perform oral sex on several inmates. I was told, you aren't going to fight back, are you, sweetness?
Oh, you're gonna be going back to the showers. And the only speed you're gonna reach is 88 dudes per hour.
Someone's going through that now. Someone's going through that right now. And to make a joke about it, it's a slap in the face. Being raped or sexually assaulted in prison is not part of the punishment. No one deserves that. We're still human beings. There's no guards that sit right here. There's nothing. There was nothing. It's like they had to come from way over here, which is the booking area, to come and see anything that was going on in here.
Hey,
Meg, what the hell are you doing in here?
shower time.
What are you doing with that loofah?
Don't worry about it.
I was taking a shower, and in comes a guy.
You told me not to worry about it.
He says, bitch, face the fucking wall, or I'll break your fucking neck. I felt like dirt. I felt like I didn't even exist. I was just there. My bunk was tapped by a guy who then explained to me that he owned me. He had purchased me from the guy who anally raped me for $20 worth of commissary items. And I was now his property. He was my prison husband. If he wanted to utilize me to pay off gambling debts, I could be bartered. Talking to staff would have been the end of my life. Staff actually came on the tier, and my husband was saying, oh, watch what I can make my hoe do. And he made me dance for him and the staff member too. They all laughed about it. Staff shook his head and walked out the door. Like, oh man, y'all crazy.
Next up is Pearl, AKA Lil Bitch. I wonder who Big Bitch is.
That would be me.
Lucky you.
I had to sit down and urinate. I had to face the wall to shower. I was not allowed at any point in time to have any mention of me being a man or having a penis. I had to wear a tucker to pull back the genitals to give the appearance of a vagina. It's extremely painful to wear most of the time. I had to wear it all of the time. May just be as simple as me raising my voice and getting smacked to me referring to myself as a he and getting punched. Any type of deviation from his rules were the threat of violence. I lost me here. I lost my humanity here. I lost my identity here. I lost myself here. And so the memories are coming back, so you're mad, and it's like I'm angry or something at the building. It's a weird feeling. And the people who can make the change, and the people who can affect the change, make jokes about it. If the story's heard and it's addressed and we can stop making the joke of it, someone won't have to go through this one day. Someone can go to prison, do their time, they can rectify their mistake, they can get their second chance. We have to start thinking of it like that. They're people. They are just people, and no person deserves that.
Okay. Pass the presentation back to you, Angie. Yeah, so we just heard from Rodney Rousseau. He's a survivor, obviously, of abuse and confinement, and a member of JDI's Survivor Council. I think Michelle said it really well earlier about the sort of jokes that exist in our society around sexual abuse and detention. And I think, the Me Too movement has made Americans more aware about sexism and sexual consent, but that sensitivity hasn't really extended to prisons or to people who are incarcerated. So Rodney's story is just really important, given that the jokes about sexual abuse in jail remain acceptable in our society. So thanks to Rodney for sharing his story, and thank you all for watching it. We're going to cover a lot of information in today's training in the next hour and a half. I'm keeping track of the time. But the most important, goal is to really enhance your awareness about this critical issue that's facing so many behind bars, and why prevention and support are so important. So let's get started. Great. So let's first talk about some numbers and dynamics about the issue. So some of you, next slide please, some of you may already be familiar with what we mean by when we say detention, but I just want to make sure everyone understands some of these basic terms. So detention refers to any time a person is confined or held by law enforcement and is not free to leave. So when we talk about detention, we're talking about a lot of different types of facilities run by different entities. That can include, that includes prisons, jails, lockups, community confinement facilities, juvenile facilities, and immigration facilities. The PREA standards that we're going to be talking about apply to all prisons, jails, lockups, community confinement facilities, and juvenile facilities. There's other types of detention, immigration falls under a different agency, DHS. Obviously, there's even like military detention facilities, and that falls, under Department of Defense. So there's all kinds of other detention facilities, but the ones that we're going to focus on today that are covered by the PREA standards are prisons and jails. And again, lockups and community confinement and juvenile facilities are also covered by PREA, but we're going to focus on prisons and jails. So real quick, can anyone from our audience today share in the chat box if they feel comfortable, what's the difference between a jail and a prison? Curious to see what folks know about the differences, and some of this changes state by state, but would love to hear from some of you. Don't be shy. Jail is before sentencing and prison is after sentencing. Okay. Prisons are long-term. Yep. Yep. All of these are great. Shorter term, longer term is prison. Yep. Can be further from family. Absolutely. Yeah, these are great. More severe crimes. Not that one we'll talk about, but yeah, okay. So these are all great. Thank you all so much for sharing your thoughts on that. So jails are typically local facilities run by counties. So for example, Fairfax County has a detention center. Not all people in jail have been convicted. I think someone mentioned that. So there is usually, before someone is sentenced, they're in a jail. And once they're sentenced, they usually go to a prison if their sentence is more than a year, typically. Jails may also hold state prisoners who have come back to the county for court hearings. That sometimes happens too. And sometimes jails also have minimum security state prisoners who serve as inmate workers at the jail. Depending on a jurisdiction, a jail can hold as few as a handful of people. Like we've been to some rural jails where there's really just literally a handful of people. And, in some of the bigger cities, there can be jails with as many as 20,000. So, it really depends on where you're at. But They tend to have very little.
Nicole, you're breaking up.
You froze, Nicole. Can you hear us?
Uh-oh. I think she's frozen. Oh, now I think she's gone.
Okay, she'll probably come back in.
Yeah. So while we're waiting, there's someone named Tamara on the signed in. Tamara, can you give us in the chat or just say out loud your last name, please?
Am I back?
Yes, you're back.
Okay. Sorry about that. I'll also have my laptop in case the connection goes bad again. Okay. I don't know if you guys had, someone was asking a question, or should I continue?
Go ahead and continue.
Okay, I'm so sorry, everyone. So yeah, as I was saying, jails are usually where people stay before their sentence or once they're sentenced, but if they have a short sentence, like a year or less typically. COVID has really kind of made that a little bit different in a lot of jurisdictions because people were trying to avoid a lot of movement. But essentially jails are short term, and prisons is where someone goes once they have been convicted to serve out their sentence if it's a long sentence. So what that means is jails are run locally, and prisons are usually are always run by the state or by the federal government. So the federal government runs the Bureau of Prisons, which are in all 50 states, I believe, have federal facilities. Prisons are usually single sex and have security levels ranging from minimum to maximum, where jails actually are usually, I mean, the population isn't mixed, but there usually is space for men and women. And they're not always divided by minimum and maximum security. Sometimes they have special units, but it's kind of everyone together until they get sentenced and moved. Any questions about the differences between prisons and jails? All right, great. And again, we'll have time for questions at the end. So let's move on and talk a little bit about who's in detention right now. So a note from the information that I'm going to be sharing, with the onset of COVID-19, jurisdictions across the nation have been releasing low-level offenders and individuals who have underlying health conditions or who are elderly and at increased risk for COVID. So these numbers that I'm sharing are constantly fluctuating, and what we're presenting here today is based on data that was accurate prior to the pandemic. But just to give you all a sense, and this information is from the Prison Policy Institute, in 2019, there were over 2 million people incarcerated at any given time in the US. Keep in mind that jails have large percentages of their population changing every day. So the number of people who pass through our nation's prisons and jails each year is actually much higher. Annually across the nation, there are over 10.6 million jail admissions. And that's enough to fill prison buses stretched bumper to bumper from San Francisco to New York City, just to give you a visual there. As you can see from this graphic, it's not just people in prisons and jails. There's a significant number of people who are on probation or parole as a condition of their sentence as well. So let's also take a closer look at what we know about who's incarcerated through the lens of a lifetime likelihood of imprisonment. For men in general, the likelihood of imprisonment at some point is 1 in 9. That drops to 1 in 17 for white men, and it jumps to 1 in 3 for Black men and 1 in 6 for Latino men. So what this means, according to the BJS, the Bureau of Justice Statistics, is that Black men were 6 times and Latino men 2.5 times more likely to be imprisoned than white men. To put this in perspective, author and civil rights advocate Michelle Alexander pointed out that in 2011, there were more African-American men in prison and jail on probation or parole than there were enslaved in 1850, before the Civil War began. So again, just a huge number and disproportionate number of people of color behind bars. Let's also look at the women population. There's also disproportionate numbers there. For all women, the lifetime likelihood of imprisonment is 1 in 56. But for white women, it's actually 1 in 111, while for Black women, it's 1 in 18, and for Latino women, it's 1 in 45. So obviously, overall, there are a lot of more men incarcerated in our country, but these disproportionate numbers of people of color are also reflected in the women's population. And I just want to make sure, is my audio okay now? Okay, please interrupt me if it ever changes and I will switch to the laptop. Great, so now let's talk about some data specific to the issue that we're discussing today of sexual abuse behind bars. I want to note that the source of this data is from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, or BJS. They're the research arm of the US Department of Justice. And one of the requirements of PREA, the Prison Rape Elimination Act, is that research be conducted to determine the extent of sexual violence in confinement settings. Before PREA, there hadn't really been sort of national data collected on this issue. Unfortunately, the data that we have available for adults is a little bit outdated. Right now, it's from 2011 and 2012, when the BJS last went to every state in the country and surveyed prisoners in different states and jails. So they have a more recent youth survey that they conducted, but for adults, this is the last one. So unfortunately, we don't have any data since the standard started to be implemented, but we suspect that the numbers are probably still similar, but just wanted to give that sort of disclaimer. What the data did tell us was that at any given year, over 200,000 people were sexually or are sexually abused in confinement settings. Of the 200,000 people sexually abused behind bars each year, just over 8,700 filed a report. That's about only 4% of all incidents of sexual abuse. And this was determined by comparing administrative data submitted to the federal government about these incidents. And as with sexual abuse in the community, it's a crime that goes severely underreported. Of the reports that were made, just under 1,000 were substantiated or proven to have occurred. Many, if not most, of the sexual abuse incidents in confinement, especially the ones between prisoners, are found to be unsubstantiated. That means that there wasn't enough evidence to prove or disprove that the incident occurred. These investigations are just really difficult, and it's not uncommon to have scant evidence. So that's what we know about the overall numbers. Like I said, the BJS did more recently survey youth, and we can see in the next slide, that was in 2018. And in the most recent youth data, we do in fact see a decrease in the incidence of sexual abuse. The previous data had told us that 10% of youth experience sexual abuse while in juvenile detention facilities. And as you can see from this graphic, the 2018 data shows that the number dropped to 7.1. So it's encouraging to see that since the release of the PREA standards, rates of sexual victimization for youth have decreased by nearly 30%. While there's still room for improvement, we want to be clear that obviously the goal is zero. No one should be sexually abused behind bars. And I think it's really important to keep that in mind, that just having the standards isn't enough. We're going to talk today about the importance of making sure that they're implemented in a meaningful way. All right, so little quiz question for you all, if you wouldn't mind answering in the chat box. Who do you think are the perpetrators of sexual abuse in detention? Do you think it's staff? Do you think it's more other prisoners? Let us know what you think in the chat box. Both. All right, great. You are all correct. The next slide. we'll see that the BJS data actually, showed pretty equal amounts of sexual abuse committed by staff versus by other prisoners. To us, this isn't surprising because given the power dynamic that exists in corrections, officers or staff hold a lot of power over detainees. But I think, our sort of media and entertainment industry have really perpetuated this belief that sexual abuse is mostly amongst prisoners, the shower jokes and that kind of stuff that we heard from Rodney. But really, staff are committing about half of the sexual abuse incidents in detention. And these are the very people that are being paid to protect the people they're abusing. So I think it's really important to be mindful of that. As I mentioned before, it's a crime that goes underreported, like in the community. So why don't incarcerated survivors of sexual abuse report? These are some of the data points that came from the BJS study. Punishment and isolation were a big fear. Being placed in solitary confinement, the loss of good time or programming. Retaliation and re-victimization was also a big one by the perpetrators and friends of the perpetrator. And of course, when you're in a confinement setting, you can't really escape your perpetrator at times or their friends. And we also know that survivors may not speak out because they fear their report will not be kept confidential. They have little trust in staff to properly handle the investigation. They don't know how to make a report. And a lot of times they don't even recognize what happened to them as really being sexual abuse. And then, of course, like in the community, there's a lot of fear of being blamed for the abuse. And while this can happen to anyone, for survivors, particularly those who are more vulnerable, like LGBT people, that we'll talk about who's the most vulnerable in a little bit. But for people who, might be more vulnerable to this abuse, there's this idea that they asked for it and they're going to be blamed, right? So those are kind of the big ones in terms of why people don't report. And for those that said, they worried about what the response would be from the facility, in a lot of ways they were right. The data showed that this is what happens when facilities, or this is how facilities respond to reports of sexual abuse, according to the BJS data. 46 when it came to reports that were done about abuse by staff. In 46% of the cases, the reports resulted in the victim being written up. In 41%, the victim was moved to restrictive housing. And in 15%, there was no facility response at all. So some of those fears are really valid. In the next slide, you can see some of the data about facility responses to reports of sexual abuse by other prisoners. In 29% of the cases, the victim was written up again. In 34%, the prisoners were moved to restrictive housing, and in 37%, there was no facility response at all. And even though some of these facility responses may align with the PREA standards, like putting someone in a safer housing, without proper training, these responses really feel like they're punishing the victim. So keep in mind that, the purpose of the standards, or one of the purposes of the standards, of course, is to change the culture and to create a reporting culture. So if we're not explaining to people, to victims, why we're moving them or why we're doing things, then it feels like they're being blamed for reporting. And so that's why these numbers are really important. Okay, now let's quickly review some of the dynamics of sexual abuse in detention. Sexual abuse is fundamentally about establishing and maintaining power and control. This is as true in prisons and jails or in any other institutional setting as it is in the community. Sexual abuse and harassment are a common part of the culture in many detention facilities. Men's facilities in particular are dominated by this hyper masculine, homophobic sort of culture. Facilities where sexual abuse and sexual harassment are rampant are also poorly run and unsafe in other ways. The violence is a contributing factor to homicides, suicides, violence against prisoners, and staff in general, and targeting of vulnerable prisoners. And lastly, sexual abuse is also often linked with the presence of contraband, which makes a facility more dangerous. So facility without sexual abuse is safer in all ways. In the next slide, we can, yeah, great, thank you. Sexual abuse by prisoners can take many forms. So let's just go over the list here. So we're talking about protective pairing, domestic violence, prostitution, gang abuse, sexual abuse, rape, and domestic violence is already there. So essentially, anytime someone is having sexual contact without consent is sexual abuse. So like in the community, prison perpetrators may use their social economic power and status to abuse others. For example, they might be higher up in a gang or connected to powerful people in the community or to staff. Men and women form friendships, romantic relationships, and mock families. As in the community, though, those romantic and familial relationships can be healthy, but they can also turn abusive. And these abusive relationships involve some of the same abusive dynamics that we see in the community, including power imbalances, support for or ignoring the abuse from community members, and blaming the victim. Let's talk about protective pairing specifically, because I think that's one that's common in detention, but not really in the community. So protective pairing refers to an arrangement where a powerful prisoner demands sex from another incarcerated person in exchange for providing protection, often referred to as hooking up or getting married. These pairings are sexually abusive, even though it may seem like the victimized incarcerated person is consenting. For vulnerable prisoners, protective pairings is often the most practical survival strategy in dangerous situations. They yield to sexual activity with the perpetrator only because the threat of violence and further abuse is so dire. So protective pairing may mirror the dynamics of domestic violence in the community, where one person exerts power and control over the other. Often the perpetrator enforces rigid gender roles, like we saw with Rodney. For example, in men's institutions, the perpetrator may force the survivor to use a woman's name or pronouns, to dress differently, or even how Rodney said, to use the bathroom by sitting down. Those are some of the dynamics that you can see in protective pairing. There are similarities between domestic or intimate partner violence and protective pairings. However, in a protective pairing situation, the terms, the exchange of sex for protection typically are defined at the onset, whereas abusive relationships typically begin as a relationship and often seemingly fully consensual. So in both dynamics, so the very fact of incarceration makes it extremely difficult for survivors to avoid having prolonged contact with the perpetrator. And from the outside, and to many staff, protective pairing relationships and abusive relationships may seem consensual, or if staff see protective pairing for what they are, they may even consider them necessary to maintain order in the facility. And again, that's where the culture issue is really important that we look at and shift that mentality. So next, I just want to go over a couple of dynamics of sexual abuse by staff. So staff sexual abuse can take many forms, including voyeurism, which is like staring at someone while they're in a state of undressed or using the bathroom, which is against PREA, unless it's part of like their routine sort of, like if they're walking down a hall just to check for safety and they happen to see someone who's in the bathroom, that's not voyeurism. It would be like, let me stand here and stare at this person, then it's voyeurism. Abusive searches, that's a super common one that we hear about. Staff prisoner, quote unquote, relationships, and of course, rape. So all forms of abuse involved in the corrections, all forms of abuse involve the corrections staff abuse of their authority, of course. This authority is based on their control over all aspects of a prisoner's life, everything from what they wear to when they brush their teeth. Staff perpetrators take advantage of having unfettered access to prisoners and fail systems of accountability that allow abuse to continue. Prisoners are often seen as manipulative or untrustworthy by officials, including those who conduct the investigations. Staff members a lot of times adhere to a code of silence, which really stifles any reporting of staff sexual misconduct. Under these conditions, staff sexual abuse is often dismissed and rarely taken seriously. Another dynamic that's really common is that staff perpetrators may offer victims contraband or other goods. They have the power to threaten their victims with a transfer or a longer sentence, or even withhold privileges such as family visits. We see that a lot with women who are told, like, if you don't have sex with me, I'm going to move you to a different prison far away from your family, or not allow visitation from your family. They also get entrapped or can entrap prisoners with things like cell phones, drugs, or threatening to put disciplinary infractions on their reports, on their record. Many incarcerated people also have a history of complex trauma and come from highly policed communities where abuse is often the norm. So many prisoners have a deep distrust of law enforcement, and they fear that any attention from law enforcement will be dangerous. So there's a strong belief that it's always better to just handle any trouble yourself. And prisoners, particularly in higher security men's prisons, are also highly concerned about being labeled a snitch or any other, for reporting any type of sexual abuse or any other problem. And lastly, in many cases of sexual abuse, corrections staff characterize the victims who were, like the staff victims who were as taken in or manipulated by a prisoner's sexual advances. And I said staff victim, but obviously I don't mean that staff could ever be victims because they hold the authority, the power here. But that's what they're seen as, right? That the staff was the victim because the inmate manipulated them. Unfortunately, that dynamic is perpetrated in pop culture. And so such portrayals ignore the reality that it's staff, not prisoners, who hold the power and who are responsible for setting professional boundaries with the people in their custody. So anyone in detention can never consent to sexual abuse. They just do not have legally, they cannot consent to sexual abuse. So anytime there's sexual contact, I just want to be really clear and emphasize this. I know I see nodding. I know you guys know this, but anytime there is sexual contact in detention, it's abusive and the staff is the perpetrator. All right, so let's talk a little bit about who's at higher risk. We already mentioned LGBT prisoners, but can folks share in the chat who else they might think is at higher risk for sexual abuse in detention? Transgender people, yeah. People who are younger. Those with mental health conditions. Great. Disabled. People who are isolated, yeah. So let's share some data from the BJS on this in the next slide. Some of you have mentioned these and you were right. One of the PREA requirements that I'll mention in the next section is that agencies must screen people for particular vulnerabilities. And here's why that's so important. The same BJS surveys that we've been discussing found that certain population of prisoners are at increased risk for victimization. So prisoners who disclosed mental illness or developmental disability were 3 times more likely to be sexually assaulted behind bars. Lesbian, gay, and bisexual prisoners were 6 times more likely to be sexually victimized. Transgender prisoners were 8 times more likely, and individuals who had previous sexual victimization were 6 times more likely. So those are the kind of the key populations that we'll talk a little bit more about. And it's especially important that steps be taken to safeguard prisoners that fall into these risk groups. So addressing things like sexual harassment before they escalate into something serious is also really important. So let's look at the rates of mental illness. And the data that we just shared is particularly alarming because we also know that those populations are overrepresented in our criminal justice system. So studies have found that people with serious mental health problems are over 3 times more likely to wind up in a prison or jail than in a hospital. Many people with mental illness are locked up for minor offenses like theft, drug use, or disturbing the peace. And as often is the case, the offense of a person who has a mental illness, especially those of the kind I just mentioned, is directly related to their illness. So as a result, prisons and jails have kind of become de facto psychiatric hospitals in our society. Few corrections facilities have enough trained staff or the resources to offer adequate mental health care within their facilities. Corrections mental health staff who work in the facilities describe having caseloads that often include hundreds and hundreds of individuals. And as a result, mental health staff often scramble to provide basic emergency services. Unfortunately, this means that many prisoners who desperately need more intensive help and who need therapy go untreated. One of you mentioned transgender people. Absolutely. BJS estimates that, next slide please, that there were over 3,200 transgender people in the US. Am I frozen? No, okay. Can we go to the next slide?
Angie?
Isn't the transgenders prisoners?
No, we're still on the mental illness one.
Weird. What about now?
No.
Nope.
Maybe stop sharing and start sharing again.
Sorry about that.
Okay. Thanks everyone for hanging in there through our technical difficulties. Okay, there we go. So the BJS estimates that there were over 3,200 transgender people in US prisons and 1,700 transgender people in jails nationwide at the time of the survey. And this was 2011, 2012. It's startling to think that it's estimated that 40% of transgender prisoners are sexually abused each year. So they're absolutely at higher risk. Unfortunately, the information on transgender prisoners is only on transgender women in male facilities. So the sample size of transgender men and female facilities wasn't enough to make estimates. And then the next 2 slides, we'll talk about gay and bisexual people. So for men, the BJS reports told us that more than 1 in 3 gay and bisexual men were sexually abused while in custody. And for women, the situation is also critical. In the next slide, lesbian and bisexual women were twice as likely to be sexually abused by staff in particular than by their straight peers. A few additional notes on what LGBTI prisoners are more likely to experience. Once LGBTI people enter a confinement setting, they're likely to experience homophobia or transphobia, bullying and harassment, discrimination or negative language, gender role expectations, and a lack of respect for who they are. These challenges are coming at them from prisoners, but also staff. With respect to being seen as who they are, many facilities are not accommodating to gender-specific needs of transgender prisoners, for example. So this is especially true for transgender prisoners who are housed based on their sex assigned at birth and not in facilities that align with their gender. So for these prisoners, they may not be allowed to express their gender as desired and may be prohibited from purchasing gender-specific commissary items. For example, a transgender woman might not be allowed to wear her hair long, may not be issued a bra or allowed to purchase one, may not be allowed to wear makeup and may be forced to wear boxer shorts like the male prisoners at the facility. Transgender men in a women's facility may not be allowed to grow facial hair and may be issued boxers. So the lack of access to appropriate gender expression increases dysphoria and exposure to bullying and violence. And while some people identify as LGBTI, there are people who may be perceived as LGBTI and are faced with these same challenges. We hear from LGBTI survivors of being blamed for sexual abuse. We hear from gay male and trans women survivors that staff basically told them they must like being sexually assaulted by other men, that they created the problem and by calling attention to themselves for their gender expression. So this is obviously, victim blaming and ignores the role of consent. And then in a lot of times as a response, they're just kind of told to man up. So those are some of the dynamics that we often hear about. Lastly, we mentioned people who had prior victimization as being at higher risk. So this data is from the Vera Institute. On the next slide. Yep. Women who are incarcerated typically have a history of domestic abuse and or sexual violence. So the Vera Institute showed that 77% of survivors from intimate partner violence and 86% are survivors of sexual violence. So that's, as this little graphic shows, more, almost 8 and, sorry, I'm like doing this number wrong, 8 out of 10, or over 8 out of every 10 women who've experienced some type of sexual violence in the past. While we don't have figures for incarcerated men, we know that in general in the community, 1 in 6 has experienced sexual abuse. And we can say anecdotally from the thousands of survivors we hear from throughout the years at JDI that incarcerated men have experienced disproportionate numbers of sexual trauma in the past. And, I can say that personally from working on our hotline, that so many of our callers, male callers, call to talk about trauma, sexual trauma from their past, especially in their childhood. Great. So now that we know a little bit about the problem, let's talk about the Prison Rape Elimination Act standards. So PREA is a lengthy and complicated civil statute. And the PREA standards, which is what we're going to be talking about, is a set of detailed guidelines for sexual abuse prevention, detection, and response. They apply to all correctional facilities and are tailored to meet the needs of different types of facilities. They're immensely important in maintaining the safety and security of corrections facilities and the people living and working in them. Compliance with the standards shows prisoners, staff, auditors, and the community at large that sexual harassment and sexual abuse are taken seriously. We won't review all of the standards. It's a very long document, but I did want to share a brief overview of what they cover and then talk about some key ones a little bit more in depth. So obviously the ultimate goal, next slide, please, is to prevent sexual abuse from happening in the first place. So the PREA standards try to accomplish this in multiple ways. They require that staff and the prisoner population be educated on this issue. For staff, that means that they need to know and understand the dynamics of sexual abuse and confinement. For prisoners, that means knowing their rights to be free from this type of abuse and knowing what to do if it happens and what the facility's response should be. In order to protect prisoners who are at higher risk, as we talked about, and to reduce their risk of sexual abuse in detention, prisoners are screened for victimization and abusiveness within 72 hours of arriving at the facilities. The goal of screening is to separate possible victims from possible perpetrators. They also use that information to determine housing and programming, again, to keep people safe. Unfortunately, sexual abuse and sexual harassment continue to occur. So the standards also require that facilities protect survivors who report sexual abuse and sexual harassment, as well as witnesses for both staff and prisoners who cooperate in the sexual abuse or harassment investigations to protect them from being retaliated against. So those are some of the things that PREA says for protecting survivors from abusers. In the next slide, we'll talk about reporting. So if an incident should occur, it's important that the facility have multiple ways for people to make reports. The idea being that with multiple ways to report, a survivor will have at least one way that they trust or that they feel comfortable making the report. So there needs to be multiple internal ways that they can report. So that should be to staff, volunteers, or contractors. And they should be able to do so in writing or just by telling someone. Many facilities now have like computer kiosks or tablets that prisoners can use to make reports as well. And there needs to be at least one reporting option that's external to the facility, such as an external law enforcement agency or another entity that's willing to accept these reports and then forward it to the facility. So I don't know if, Ron, if you're still on with us, I'd love for you to share what the external reporting option is for people in Fairfax in your detention center.
Yes, our external reporting is through a PREA hotline, which that's what most facilities use. That hotline actually goes to our emergency operations center, which is dispatch for the police department, fire department, and everything else, transportation. And they in turn take that information from the reported alleged victim and turn it back over to the sheriff's office once the report is taken, because it has to be timely, and obviously has to be operated 24/7 so they can receive those calls, at any time. So, and also the outside reporting entity cannot be under the authority of, say, the sheriff or the Department of Corrections. So it has to be a separate entity altogether.
Great, that's great. And yeah, absolutely. I mean, the intention of the PREA standards on this is that for a survivor who doesn't, who's been abused, particularly they've been abused by someone on staff, they may not trust anyone in the system, right? They may not feel comfortable reporting at all. So having that outside reporting option is really important. Facilities want to know if something's happened, right? So in order for an investigation to occur, they have to know. In order for the investigation to happen, they need to know that something occurred. So while facilities want to know as much as possible, another important key component of the standard is that survivors can report anonymously. So that also, makes it a little bit more comfortable for some people to report. So even with little information, the facility can and must do an investigation into any report, even if it's anonymous. Additionally, facilities need to provide ways for third parties to make reports. So third party being like friends or loved ones or attorneys to report on behalf of the survivor. So again, multiple ways for reports of sexual abuse to come in. That's a big requirement for the standards. Next slide, we'll talk about medical and mental health care. So obviously critical, both of those are critical to a survivor's immediate and long-term healing. For example, during sexual abuse, the victim may suffer injuries and need medical attention. They may also be exposed to sexually transmitted infections or become pregnant, and all of these require long-term care. For incidents that occur recently, facilities must offer sexual forensic exams in order to collect forensic evidence to assist with the investigation. All of the medical and mental health care services provided as a result of sexual abuse must be provided at no cost to the survivor and should be consistent with community level of care. And we're going to talk a little bit more about these since these are pertinent to a lot of you on the call today. In the next slide, we'll talk about how the standards really have a focus on increasing accountability. They require that all reports be taken seriously and investigated. The investigations must be prompt, thorough, and objective. Doesn't matter when the accident occurred, even if it was months ago, it must be investigated by investigators who have been trained to conduct sexual abuse investigations. Perpetrators, whether prisoners or staff, must be held accountable. Substantiated investigations, that means investigations that were determined to have, where the incident occurred, must be referred for prosecution as well. Incidents that are not criminal but administrative, for example, an incident that occurred due to staff neglect or an incident of sexual harassment, must also be dealt with accordingly to facility agency policy. All incidents, substantiated or unsubstantiated, must be reviewed to determine if there were factors involved that could be addressed to prevent future incidents from occurring. All right, and then lastly, the most relevant to many of you in our audience today are the victim service provisions. So that's, I put the numbers here because those are the ones that we're going to be talking about in case anyone wants to refer back to them, but it's 115.21 and 115.53. So standard 115.21 is the standard for evidence protocol and forensic medical examinations. It requires that the agency offer all victims of sexual abuse access to a forensic medical exam, again, free of cost. It also states, though, that the agency shall attempt to make available a victim advocate from a rape crisis center to accompany them during the exam and investigatory process for emotional support, crisis intervention, information, and referrals. Again, this is in line with what we do for survivors in the community, right? Standard 115.53 is called inmate access to outside confidential support services. So this standard states that prisoners should have access to outside victim advocates for emotional support services related to sexual abuse by giving prisoners mailing addresses and telephone numbers, including toll-free hotline numbers where available, of local, state, or national victim advocacy or rape crisis organizations. And for persons detained solely for civil immigration purposes, they should also be given Immigrant Services Agency's information. The facility shall enable reasonable communication between prisoners and these organizations and agencies in as confidential a manner as possible. And we'll discuss what we mean by as confidential a manner as possible shortly. The standards also say that facilities shall inform prisoners prior to giving them access to about the extent to which any communication will be monitored. Oops, I don't know if it was something that came in. Can you guys still hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry, I heard like a beep.
Yeah, I did too.
Okay. So yeah, so to the extent that any communication is going to be monitored, they also need to make sure that the prisoners know that. And last but not least, the agency shall maintain or attempt to enter into a memorandum of understanding or other type of agreement with a community service provider that's able to provide prisoners with this confidential emotional support. Great. So again, that was a super quick overview of the key points of the standards. We could have hours and hours and hours of training on that, but I wanted to just give an overview before we go into the specifics about providing victim services in detention. So with that, let's talk about what this all means to you all here on our call today. In the next slide, I have another quick question. I'd love to hear from those of you who are providing or have provided services already to people behind bars. What are some of the responses that you heard from survivors when they report a sexual abuse? What are some of the things that they get as a response? And please feel free to put those in the chat box. And I just want to say, I haven't been able to check all the messages coming in, but I want to point out this last one about calls coming from detention about sexual abuse prior to incarceration. And that's absolutely correct. For us too, most of the calls we get are about abuse that's happened to them in the past, and they absolutely deserve to be supported. And the PREA standards, that's why they require facilities to share information for local rape crisis organizations so that folks, regardless of when they were abused, can reach out. Lack of knowledge by person they reported to about community resources. Yeah, I could see that. Confusion about rights. Yep. Some responders only want to hear about current abuse. So in this next slide, and before I read some of these responses, I want to share that at JDI, we usually receive about 200 letters and over 50 calls a month from survivors of sexual abuse in detention, and that's from all across the country. So some of the responses that we get, I want to share in this next slide. These are responses that survivors have shared with us that they received when they disclosed their abuse. And as I read these out loud, keep in mind that the first person the survivor tells about the sexual abuse has a significant impact on their overall healing from trauma. So imagine the impact on a survivor when they hear the following after disclosing sexual abuse. A victim's own father said, "How could you let yourself get raped? What kind of man are you?" A nurse in a facility told one survivor, "Your medical kite said that you were coming down for chest pains. So you're basically telling me that you lied about a life-threatening medical condition. I'm going to need to speak to an officer about this." An investigator told a survivor, "We reviewed the videotape from that night and didn't see an officer raping you. We know you're lying. If you don't retract your statement, we'll charge you with making a false report." A survivor's cellmate told him, "Are you for real? I can't hang out with no punk. Don't say nothing to me about that again, bro." And this is what a correctional counselor suggested to one survivor. "I can see from your file that you've had issues with staff at other institutions. Perhaps you'd be better off in administrative segregation so that we can keep a closer eye on you." So it's not surprising why victims of sexual abuse in detention don't report, right? They need people who will believe them. They need people who will be there to support them. So just wanted to share that up front at the beginning of this section, just to highlight the importance of providing services and how we respond to people seeking those services. All right, so in the next slide, before we get into the specifics about victim services, I want to quickly explain the difference between these three PREA topics that you see on the slide, especially the role of the victim advocate in each, because they frequently get mixed up. So two of the standards focus on reporting, the top two on here. As we talked about, the external and third-party reporting. I often hear people talk about third-party reporting when they actually mean the external reporting. So just to clarify, external reporting is an entity outside of the correctional agency that has agreed to accept reports of sexual abuse, as Ron shared with us their external reporting option. This is primarily a reporting option for prisoners, but staff can also use it. And this is not a role for the victim advocacy organization to play. So again, that's the outside external reporting option. And advocacy organizations are sometimes asked to serve in this capacity. They can politely decline and offer just the confidential support services. And the DOJ actually has a really helpful FAQ on this. And they say the purpose of this provision is to provide prisoners with a way to report sexual abuse or harassment to someone outside of the corrections agency. The focus of this standard is on reporting of sexual abuse and sexual harassment and not on providing support to victims. So now for those of you in Virginia, this gets a little tricky because your Department of Correction and State Coalition actually have a different setup that from what I just said, but I'll explain that at the end of today's presentation when we share their contact information. So again, that's outside reporting. Third-party reporting is reporting that family members, loved ones, attorneys, even other inmates can do on behalf of someone else. Again, that's not the role of the advocate because that's reporting. So like I've mentioned before, the place for the advocate is with the confidential support services. And these are for all prisoners and are not just to support survivors, but also a source of information so that survivors can make informed decisions about what's best for them and for healing. So certainly advocates can talk about their reporting options, can tell them, here's how to report, and this is what it might mean if you make a report, but they should not be the ones making the report or being the reporting option. Great. So let's talk more about victim services during a forensic exam. In the next slide, facilities should explain the kinds of services available when a prisoner first comes into the facility. And Angie, I think the slide might be frozen again. Thanks.
So my computer right now is flashing black and white. So Mary, I just sent you the PowerPoint in case something happens, and I will make Mary host. I'm not gonna log off. I'm just gonna kind of let it flash. But can you see the slides?
Yes. Do you want me to, I can also share the slides and.
Okay, I mean, we're good right now. It's just.
Okay. If it happens again, yeah, I'm happy to.
It doesn't, I don't think it affects anybody else. It's just happening on my two monitors.
Okay.
I'm just gonna pull through.
Thanks so much. And sorry there's been so many technical glitches today, everyone. Thanks for hanging in there.
Hey,
with
we're
us.
working through it. We're all good.
Yeah.
We're moving along.
Yeah, so facilities should explain the kinds of services available when a prisoner first comes into the facility. This should be during initial or comprehensive prisoner education or both. And information about the advocacy accompaniment should also be included in the prisoner handbook. But it's not enough to just tell prisoners when they first get to your facility that should anything happen to them, they have the right to have an advocate to support them. Because in a moment of crisis, prisoners are not going to remember what you told them at intake, right? So they should be told that an advocate is available to them when the incident happens, when they're going to the hospital. And it's then the survivor's choice whether or not they want to allow the advocate to provide them with these services. A survivor should never be forced to accept the services of an advocate. However, it is possible that hearing about the advocate services from the advocate is a better option. So it's possible that you could have the advocate come to the hospital, talk to the survivor about the services, and then allow the survivor to decide whether or not they want to accept those services. These services extend to not just the forensic medical exam, but also the investigatory interviews. And ongoing emotional support, crisis intervention, information, and referrals. The advocate never forces a survivor to do anything, obviously, but just provides them with the information to allow them to make informed decisions. As some of you know, facilities have to be audited for PREA compliance, and that's all prisons and jails. And auditors should talk with facility prisoners who have reported sexual abuse, and the victim advocates too, to learn how the advocacy services have been offered to survivors. The auditor has to verify that survivors are offered hospital accompaniment services, and they must also review how survivors are being told about these services and how the Rape Crisis Center is notified to provide services. If facilities use staff to accompany survivors to provide services when an advocate cannot, like a trained staff person, the auditor has to determine how those people were selected and trained and the reasons why an advocate was not available. So again, the standards really, really push for a community advocate person to be called out when someone's going to the hospital. That's sort of the first choice. And if an advocate's not available, then a trained staff person should be offered. All right, let's review access to outside confidential support services in the next slide. So this is standard 115.53. Agencies must provide access, as we talked about, to outside victim advocates for emotional support services, either by telephone, mail, or both. And remember that these services are to be made available to all prisoners who've experienced sexual abuse, as we mentioned, no matter when it happened in their life. So it's not just for this, the standard is not just for abuse that happened behind bars. So this includes people who were sexually abused as children or as adults in the community. And it's not limited to sexual abuse someone experiences in confinement. Detention facilities have to make a good faith effort to enter into a written agreement or an MOU with advocacy organizations to provide these services. And I know that the Fairfax Jail and DSDS have that. Yeah, thumbs up there. In some cases, victim advocacy organizations have declined to sign an agreement because corrections officials were making unreasonable demands, such as insisting that advocates share survivors' confidential information with the facility staff. In other cases, an MOU was signed, but the organization was never contacted again, and they failed to refer survivors to them. So an auditor will want to determine exactly what has happened, and it's not enough to just check the boxes, right? It's not enough to just have the MOU. You need to actually be offering the services and making them accessible to people. Services are to be provided in as confidential manner as possible. And this is a point where I think advocacy organizations and corrections need to talk to make sure that both parties are in agreement about what confidential manner as possible means. So I mentioned that JDI operates a hotline, and we have an MOU with 2 agencies that we work with that states that calls are to be unmonitored and unrecorded. And they were able to set that up with their phone providers. At GTL is what the 2 agencies that we work with use. And also in our agreement, we included our confidentiality policy, which makes it clear that communication with prisoners is privileged unless someone is threatening to harm themselves or others, or if they disclose abuse involving a minor. So of course, any limits to confidentiality, again, should be shared with prisoners. So if you're unable to come to an agreement about calls being unmonitored or unrecorded, then that's something that you need to let folks know before they start sharing their information. And then real quick in the next slide, just some basic rule on confidentiality. Again, it's frequently a big concern for service providers, because for service providers, it's standard practice, right? But for corrections, mandatory reporting is the standard, right? So the 2 sides, corrections and advocacy, have very different roles, but it's important for them to discuss confidentiality. And here's the basic rule. So the decision to share or not share is the survivor's choice. And an advocate cannot release information without the informed consent of survivors. So that's kind of the bottom line. And I think, it's hard for, or it's not hard, but it's very different for corrections. So it's important to talk about it. So for example, even mental health staff in a facility, you'd think maybe would be held to the same confidentiality standards, but they're not. So anyone that works in a correctional facility is a mandatory reporter. So that's why it's so different for advocates and why it's so important that it's discussed beforehand. All right, a couple of, in the next slide, confidentiality considerations. So how will mail between an incarcerated survivor and an advocacy agency be processed? Can it be labeled? Again, these are things to talk about when you're establishing services. Can it be labeled as legal mail and treated with the same level of confidentiality as client-attorney privilege? That's what we do at JDI. What will the parameters around confidentiality look like in all aspects of the victim services for incarcerated people? So can the calls be unmonitored, unrecorded? What space is being used for in-person services, if that's something you're doing? Like if you have counselors going in to provide one-on-one or group sessions, what kind of space is being used and what kind of privacy is being afforded? Is staff in the room or can they be outside? These are all things that you can talk about with your partners to ensure that confidentiality is prioritized. All right, and what are some barriers that you should be thinking about when providing services? So even the best support services will be ineffective in a facility if there are barriers to prisoners' ability to access them. So for example, prisoners may have limits on access to phones. This has been particularly concerning during the pandemic when so many facilities were locked down and people were in their cells and didn't have access to phones. Or they may be required to request access to the phone numbers that they're going to call. So like if in your facility, the prisoners have to have a call list, which means like a sort of approved list of people they can call. And they're not allowed to call this hotline number for emotional support. That's not giving them access, right? Meaningful access. If they have to ask to call this number, then they're losing their anonymity and their confidentiality. So those are things to think about. How are prisoners learning about the services? How is this information being shared? Is it being shared in ways that's accessible to all? You need to consider language differences, reading levels, disabilities. All of these things are important when you're trying to inform the population of the services and truly make them accessible. If you're using posters that are getting torn down every day, are you replacing those? Is the font in your posters big enough for folks to read? Do people in segregation have access to that information and to the phones? So those are all considerations and barriers that can be barriers to access. In the next slide, just a couple other factors to consider. How are survivors treated when they call for support can have a significant impact on whether they continue to call. So, I'm sorry, let me get a drink of water. Those of you with us today who are service providers, we know you're committed professionals and committed to providing outstanding service to people who reach out, including incarcerated survivors. Some providers, however, may be understaffed, may be unable to consistently answer calls, or even may be uncomfortable interacting with someone calling from a prison or jail. So it's a good practice to really engage with support providers. Advocates, could be coming out to your facility to take a tour, meet with leadership, really establish that relationship, make them more comfortable with providing these services. And doing cross-training between your correction staff and your advocacy staff could really benefit both sides and help them understand each other's roles and responsibilities and how to work together. Lastly, I want to discuss some dynamics about survivors behind bars, and these are things to think about for our advocates on the call who are providing services or planning to provide services. And again, this is one of those topics we could talk about for hours, but unfortunately today, I just have some time to highlight a few things. But I'll be sharing some resources at the end of our training today on providing services that you can get more information and more support. But many incarcerated survivors have a history of complex trauma. As we reviewed before, they often have experienced sexual or physical abuse as children, sexual assault, intimate partner violence, human trafficking, gang violence, and or police violence. So when we're working with someone who's incarcerated, the focus of your support may be on this previous trauma. And we found that many of the survivors who reach out are looking for help related specifically, as I mentioned earlier, to childhood sexual abuse. And people who are incarcerated have also often faced extreme poverty and have limited resources. So you may be the first place that they've ever reached out to for help in their healing journey. So just important to keep that in mind. Also, in the next slide, keep in mind that when someone's incarcerated, there are additional barriers to healing than that a survivor may face that can be helpful to be aware of. So when someone's in a prison or a jail, they have very little control over their body and their environment, and a general lack of privacy, which can feel like being back in the abusive environment or remind a survivor of how they felt when they were assaulted. And this can be exacerbated by the general lack of autonomy and privacy behind bars. So I think that's particularly important to think about when you're, for example, doing a safety plan with someone, right? It's going to look very different than when you're doing a safety plan with someone in the community. What they have control over is very limited. So even something as the lights can be triggering, the doors closing, and all of those things. So as for any survivor, the feeling of being alone in one's trauma and healing is especially true for incarcerated survivors, in that detention settings can further isolate folks. For survivors who report the abuse, there's a strong likelihood that the survivor may be forced to have ongoing contact with the perpetrator if it was abuse that happened in the facility. It's not like they can move out, right, or go stay with a friend. So for this reason, the survivor may be concerned about being retaliated against for reporting. And given the challenges to healing in detention settings, sometimes the survivor's reaction to trauma may be heightened. Like things like the use of restraints and invasive searches, which are obviously common in detention settings, can also be incredibly triggering for a survivor. And unfortunately, staff often misunderstand these reactions, and survivors are often punished for behavior that's normal response to trauma. So again, this is where the staff training is so important, and why the standards include that staff be trained on things like dynamics of sexual abuse, so that they're aware of that. All right, and then the next slide, why providing support to prisoners matters. So the benefits that support services provide to survivors cannot be emphasized enough. Access to support helps survivors process and understand the assault and deal with its impact. And the benefits continue to accrue even after someone is released from custody, which, as we learned at the beginning of this training, is 95% of the time. In the preamble to the PREA standards, the Department of Justice recognized that prisoners who receive proper support services will even enhance their, quote, enhance their ability to reintegrate into the community and maintain stable employment upon their release from prison. So yeah, it's important for them to process current or past trauma. It lessens the behavioral issues in the facility and mental health issues, and improves reentry success. I think the slides were frozen because we're great. And lastly, I want to highlight self-care, and this is self-care for you all. So self-care can look different for different people in different circumstances, but it can mean maintaining healthy boundaries with your clients and staff when you're working with folks in detention. And this is true for those of you, joining us from corrections and those of you joining us from the advocacy field. Talk with your supervisors about your organization's self-care and how they can foster boundaries and wellness in the workplace. Remember to maintain healthy boundaries between your professional and personal life. Remember that you can take advice and use the grounding techniques that you suggest to your clients to help you manage workplace stress. Taking care of yourself in this work helps you feel better in and out of the workplace, and it helps you do your best work. So be clear with your clients about your limits and what you can and cannot do for them. Don't ever overpromise things. You won't let them down, and you won't let yourself down. Prepare yourself for the unexpected, because it's likely to occur, especially when working with incarcerated survivors, and especially with all the different changes that happen in facilities and all the different movements and lockdowns. And finally, take care of yourself outside of work. What practices and habits support you feeling a sense of wellness? And personal care builds your resilience to hold the emotional impact of a survivor's trauma. And I always like to include this self-care slide, just because, again, I mean, the work we do can be really heavy, and especially when we're working with survivors behind bars. I mean, we talked about the complex trauma that they bring, and I think that there's also an additional layer of feeling helpless when you're talking to incarcerated survivors. You can't offer them, or it feels like you can't offer them, the same level of support or the same resources that you can offer someone in the community who has who has more freedom. So it's important to really take care of ourselves. And and for those of you working in corrections, it's also critical to take care of yourselves. We know how stressful of an environment it can be. So this also applies to you. And then I want to close the substance of our substantive part of our training with a quote from Arturo. He's an incarcerated survivor of sexual abuse. All right. So JDI had already been providing individual counseling for Arturo, and worked with facility officials to help him after he was victimized by his cellmate. Ultimately, Arturo's access to services meant that reporting sexual abuse was not as scary as an experience as he thought it might have been. And after Arturo made a report, the facility did an investigation, and the evidence was forwarded to the prosecutor's office for review. But the DA declined to prosecute. So the investigator brought the JDI counselor to tell Arturo that the case would not go to court. The investigator was worried that Arturo because he'd been suicidal when he made the report. So the investigator told Arturo that even though the prosecutor had declined to prosecute, he would mark it in the perpetrator's file, and the perpetrator was to be placed in single cell going forward. And also that the perpetrator would be charged administratively with sexual assault. The investigator said, "I know this is disappointing, but it's nothing you did. after that conversation, Arturo said, I really appreciate how you handle this. I'm disappointed, but I get it. They didn't think a jury would care about a prisoner. What can I do to thank you? And the investigator responded, if you hear anyone else being threatened, you tell me. Then Arturo said, I don't know how to thank you. I never thought I'd be treated this way. I can honestly say that I would tell another inmate that reporting here can help them. No one is more surprised than me to hear me say that. So again, before this experience, he thought reporting isn't something I want to do. It's not worth it. But after, receiving support services and having an investigator and staff who, were trauma informed and willing to believe him and take his report seriously, even though the outcome wasn't necessarily what he wanted, he was encouraged by the process. So I think that's what we want. That's the goal when we talk about having a reporting culture in corrections. Great. So before we get to your questions, I want to share a few contacts and resources. So the Virginia Sexual and Domestic Violence Action Alliance is an amazing resource. It's a state coalition, and it's an amazing resource to all service providers in Virginia and to any corrections folks on the call. They currently operate the statewide prison hotline. And I mentioned before that they have a little bit of a different arrangement with the DOC because they are also the outside reporting option for the agency. And again, while it's not the way that the DOJ wanted things to be laid out, they wanted an outside reporting agency to be a separate thing, and then the support services to be provided by advocates separately. I think Virginia is one of the places we've seen where they've been able to keep those two services very separate so that survivors can still get confidential support services without reporting. So when prisoners call I think it's like pound 55 or something, when they call that line in any Virginia DOC prison, they're asked something like, don't quote me, but something like press 1 for reporting and 2 for emotional support services. So they're able to kind of keep those two things separate. But if your agency is trying to establish services in detention facilities, or if you're a detention facility trying to connect with local agencies for victim services, definitely reach out to the Alliance. On the slide is information for Becky, who oversees the PREA program there currently. And then of course, I guess the slide wasn't on the Virginia Alliance information, huh? I think
I've just asked Angie if she can change it. I can bring it up if need be.
All right, so now so the one before, can we go back just so folks have in case anyone needed the Action Alliance information. And then we can go to the next slide. Great. So of course, we want to thank DSVS again for this opportunity to connect with you all today. And we're excited to see their continued partnership with the Sheriff's Office and Detention Center. I think sadly, this is Michelle's last week. So on this slide, we have Angie's information instead. And you can reach out to her with any questions. Great. So with that, I haven't been able to monitor the chat box to see if we've gotten any questions, but if you have a question and you haven't submitted it, please feel free to do so now. And I'm going to ask Mary if we had any questions during the training.
They were answered by Michelle.
Okay.
So I haven't seen anything that she did not answer, but Michelle, if I missed something, let me know. But I think you answered anything that people asked as you went up, as Nicole went along.
Okay, well, while we see if folks have any other questions, can we show, and actually I can do this. Let me show our additional resources. I'm gonna send some links in the chat. Hopefully those came through, and I
Yes.
will also show my screen.
So there is a question, are there any follow-up resources you recommend for sexual abuse victims in immigration detention settings?
Yeah, so can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. So anyone in an immigration detention facility should, sorry, was it in a detention facility, immigration detention facility, or?
Immigration detention.
Okay. So the PREA standards don't apply to immigration detention facilities because they fall under Department of Homeland Security, but Department of Homeland Security has their own set of standards or their own policy around this issue. But I think in terms for service providers, they should be offering the same, if they're able to, the same services that they provide to folks in prisons and jails. You know, obviously there might be some challenges around language, but and access, but I think in terms of the services that you all can provide, yeah, it the same. I don't know if that answers the question. The same resources. So I'm actually sharing, I shared on the chat box some resources for advocates about, you know, our Hope Behind Bars, which is a guide to helping survivors of sexual abuse in detention, or advocates who are providing those services. No One Left Behind, and also a resource that we developed with the Resource Sharing Project. And these are all tools that you can use as you're building your services for incarcerated people. But obviously people in immigration facilities are going to have similar situations and in terms of being isolated and having prior trauma. I think, you know, one thing I can say is if you're going to provide services to people in immigration detention facilities, is to make sure that your staff has an understanding of, you know, the trauma that folks in immigration detention facilities might have. And there's obviously some additional layers there of being away from, you know, their family and their culture in a different way than prisoners in their own country are. And just kind of having, depending on the population that you're working with, having a better understanding of what some of those challenges and needs may be, which can be different for every facility, of course.
Yeah, exactly. In JDI's opinion, can prisoners engage in consensual sex with each other?
Yeah, so if there's two people who are, you know, consenting adults engaging in sexual contact, again, I mean, it's tricky, right? Because there can be so many power dynamics even amongst the prisoner population. But like we mentioned, you know, there could be gangs, or someone might be doing it for protection. So it's tricky to say, but yes, I mean, yes, people can have consensual sex. It's always, as far as I know, it's always against agency policy. So like all prisons and jails have policies against consensual sex, but it's not against PREA. PREA is only about sexual abuse, which means there isn't consent. But obviously, I think any relationship that is reported or is you know, is happening in a facility and the staff are aware about should be investigated to ensure that it's not abusive, that there has been consent. Because again, I mean, some of those dynamics can make it hard to for people to see that it's not consensual when it's something like we talked about, where there's a power dynamic or someone's you know, consenting just or seemingly consenting for protection. So yes, there can be a consensual sex. No, it's not allowed by the facility, and yes, it should be investigated to ensure that it is actually consensual.
I have a question about mandated reporting, and specifically with Fairfax County. So I'm trying to identify what would qualify as mandated reporting. So obviously there's the PREA hotline, which was discussed, but we also have a 24-hour hotline that's run by DSVS. And so typically with folks who are contacting our hotline who are not in detention, that's completely confidential. We wouldn't have to report to anyone unless, you know, the typical mandated reporting for child protective services, adult protective services, or intention to harm self or someone else. So is, by saying mandated reporting, are you saying that there's a requirement for anyone who's in detention to report to the PREA channel? Or if someone was to call us through that 24-hour hotline, is that something where they can maintain confidentiality?
Ron, I don't know if you want to take that one since it's specific to.
Yeah, so I think your question is, does the DSVS hotline, is there some type of mandatory reporting if you get that call? Is that the question? No, that call is confidential. It's toll free. So you don't have an obligation, except for under mandatory reporting laws in the state of Virginia, that it's a juvenile or a vulnerable adult, that you do not have to report that unless the inmate requests that you report it. So the inmate can either call the hotline that is operated by the Emergency Operations Center, which they are reporting to an outside entity, and if they are looking for an advocacy, then they contact the DSVS. Now, what was also mentioned was reporting inside a facility. So you have a lot of different, you have deputies, you have clergy, you have volunteers, contractors, to include, say, CSB, Community Service Board. We have probably 12 counselors that for behavioral health. If an inmate reports that they've been sexually assaulted in the facility, then the CSB has an obligation to report that to the sheriff's office, yes. But that's different than DSVS, because if you're in the facility providing counseling, again, you have that confidentiality level.
Yeah, great question, because I know that DSVS, I was gonna say that's a great question, because I know DSVS is slightly different than like the average rape crisis center, because there is that like government component. So yeah, that's great. Thank you, Ron. Any other questions? And folks, feel free to send them on the chat box or to just unmute yourselves and engage with us.
I'd like to Ron to share a little bit of what they tell incoming inmates, or what signage or advertisement there is about their rights and how to contact us.
Okay, so when an inmate is initially brought into the booking facility, the ways to report are on the back of their property receipt. So when an inmate, when the deputy processes that inmate and takes his personal belongings, they're given a receipt for the property, which also includes their PIN number to use the phone. So on the back of that form has the ways to report at the Fairfax County Sheriff's Office. Once they're put in, say, a holding cell, they're group holding cells initially, unless there's a reason why the person has to be segregated. There's posters. Most of the posters are 18 by 22. It depends on what housing unit. Every housing unit has a poster. Those posters also have the DSVS information and the contact number. Also, we have just went to tablets. So when an inmate wants to utilize the tablet, they have to acknowledge reading again what the poster says. And I'm working on, because we just went to a different vendor, when every time an inmate picks up the phone, they have to listen to the message, which also identifies the ways to report and the advocate phone number. So just really drilling it down. I've done audits where you ask those questions and you're like, do you know how to report? And the inmates are like, oh my goodness, every time I pick up the phone, I have to listen to it, which is a good thing. So it's really, it's pretty much everywhere. Even if they try to ignore it, we also have their when they first come in once they're classified. There's a longer educational video which we've done in English and Spanish that they have to view, and then we also run that every morning from between the hours of 8 and 9 throughout the jail on the TV. So again, they have to watch it when they first come in to be classified, and regardless if you're there for a year, you're going to watch it or have to at least view it or see it or listen to it every single day between 8 and 9.
Thanks so much, Ron. And I just want to, I reread the question from Blanca on the chat. if you're looking for specific resources to share, if that the question was, are there any follow-up resources you can recommend for sexual abuse victims in immigration detention settings? I'm going to share our page for survivor resources, and that's for anyone behind bars. Anyone behind bars can reach out to JDI using legal confidential mail. The address is there at the bottom of that link. Or sorry, no, actually, if how we can help, it's on there. They can reach out to us, and we send them resources, including a state-specific resource. So we have a resource guide for every state that has local organizations, legal organizations, government agencies that they can contact. And we also send them some of JDI's resources and tools to kind of help in their healing process. And yeah, so I just wanted to share that because it's absolutely something that if you're in contact with someone in an immigration facility, you can share that with them. And there might be some resources within our resource guide that for your state that you're able to pull from. Great. Any other questions, comments?
I have one, but anyone else is welcome to go first. So this is kind of a weird question, Nicole. Feel free to not answer it, but I was at a meeting of some victim advocates who work at the Rappahannock Regional Jail, which is south of here and covers several counties, and they're having a problem of an extensive economic market develop of exchange for commissary money for sex. And I suppose that's true anywhere, but that for them, they feel like it's just gone rampant, and it's building trafficking and exploitation relationships that then continue after jail. So they're really worried about it. And so the best thing they found is really just trying to talk with those people, the inmates, and explain to them, the risks of this situation, but they're having a really tough go of it. And I just wondered if you had any insights into that.
Yeah, I mean, it's awful, right? And that happens because people behind bars don't always have access to basic necessities, right? And so commissary can be something where you buy, soap and shampoo or toothbrush. I mean, it's also a place where people buy their favorite snacks, which, don't get me wrong. I mean, if you're, incarcerated for a very long time and you miss your favorite snacks, I get that. But I think, most people that that are having to exchange sexual favors for commissary items is an awful situation to be in. So I think talking, like you said, to them directly about those risks, but also this is where I think it's really important for advocates to have a good relationship with the corrections agency that they're providing services at, and having that conversation with folks at the agency about what's going on there that people are being forced to do that, right? I think there's something going on there where people's needs aren't being met if they're being forced to do that. So I think it's also a conversation that can happen with the staff there, both about helping them understand why people are being forced to do that, and also just helping them be able to recognize that type of abuse. And I think that's a great opportunity for some cross training. But yeah, it's just awful, and yeah, unfortunately, really common. Right. Well, I'm going to quickly share this last slide, so that anyone wanting to reach out to JDI can do so. We're always available to answer any questions. We provide technical assistance. That's how Michelle connected with us, was just, I think, a random email like, hey, would you guys want to do a training? So please feel free to reach out to us with any questions. You can also follow us at on Facebook, on social media, on Facebook and Twitter. We also have an Instagram page now, which is not on here, but for those of you on the gram, you're also welcome to follow us there. But it was so nice to be with you all today. And again, thank you for being on so early and for dealing with us with all of our technical issues today. We really appreciate it. And yeah, I don't know if Angie and Michelle or Mary, you guys have anything else to add. And and just a huge thank you to Ron as well for being on today.
Thank you so much, Nicole and Ron, for a great training this morning. For the participants, we will, Michelle, if you wouldn't mind just putting the survey in the chat box. It's a really short survey. It takes about 3 minutes. If you could please complete it. The slides and the recording as well as the survey will be sent to you via email by the end of today or tomorrow. And like Michelle said, we have 2 more trainings in the sexual violence series. The next one will be in September, and it will focus on sexual violence and strangulation. I will send the link to that training in my email as well. So whoever is interested can register. But thanks again, Nicole. We apologize for all of the technical difficulties today. And we look forward to seeing everybody else in other trainings. Thank you and have a good afternoon.
And I'm sorry, I forgot to have the evaluation link pulled up, but we will send that in the email following the presentation. Thank you. Thank you, Nicole. That was really wonderful.
Thank you all.